There is a question your soulmate may have remembered only after it was already too late to ask it naturally. Not the kind of question people ask when everything feels easy, but the kind that suddenly becomes painfully important when silence has replaced conversation. Somewhere in their mind, they may have returned to a moment between you and realized something unsettling. They spent so much time trying to understand what you were doing that they never stopped to ask what you were actually feeling. And now that realization is following them. Maybe they remember a conversation where you seemed distant, and instead of asking what was wrong, they made an assumption. Maybe you became quieter, and they interpreted that silence as disinterest. Maybe you pulled back because you were protecting your heart, while they convinced themselves that you simply didn't care. What if they were wrong? What if the answer they needed was sitting inside you the entire time, and they never had the courage, patience, or awareness to ask for it? Imagine standing in front of a door for years, convinced there is nothing behind it because you never heard a sound from the other side. Then one day, you realize you never actually knocked. That may be the realization your soulmate is having now. They may be looking back at the connection and thinking, why didn't I just ask? Why didn't they ask what you wanted? Why didn't they ask whether you still cared? Why didn't they ask what you were afraid of? Why didn't they ask what you needed from them? One simple question could have changed the direction of an entire conversation, perhaps even an entire relationship. And the strange part is, they may have believed they already knew your answer. They watched your behavior, interpreted your silence, studied your reactions, and created a story in their own mind. But they never verified it with you. They filled in the blanks themselves. And now those blanks are haunting them because they finally understand that an assumption is not the same thing as truth. You might be wondering why they would suddenly think about this now, after so much time has passed. Because distance has a way of exposing the questions we were too distracted, too afraid, or too proud to ask when someone was standing right in front of us. And perhaps your soulmate is finally realizing that the most important thing they never asked you wasn't about the past at all. It was about your heart. And once they understood that, they couldn't stop wondering what your answer would have been. And this is where the situation becomes even more complicated. Because your soulmate may be realizing that they didn't actually know what you felt at the time. They thought they did. They created an explanation in their mind, accepted it as truth, and then made decisions based on it without ever giving you the opportunity to confirm or correct it. Maybe they saw your silence and assumed you had lost interest. Maybe they noticed you becoming more distant and believed you were trying to leave. Maybe they felt you pulling back and decided that you no longer cared enough to stay. But what if your silence meant something completely different? What if you were waiting for them to show you that they cared? What if you were afraid of saying too much because you didn't know where they stood? What if you were protecting yourself because every time you tried to get closer, something inside you told you to be careful? These are the questions that can completely change the meaning of an old memory. Your soulmate may now be looking back at those moments and realizing that they interpreted your behavior without ever asking what was happening underneath it. And that realization can be painful because assumptions are comfortable when you make them, but they become incredibly uncomfortable when you discover they may have been wrong. Imagine someone standing outside a house at night. They see the lights are off, so they assume nobody is home. They walk away without knocking. Years later, they discover someone was inside the entire time, sitting quietly and wondering why they never came in. That is what an unanswered question can do to a connection. It can make two people believe they were farther apart than they actually were. Your soulmate may have thought your silence was rejection when it was actually uncertainty. They may have interpreted your hesitation as a lack of feeling when you were actually waiting for emotional safety. They may have assumed you had already moved on when, at that time, you were still hoping they would finally become honest with you. And perhaps the most difficult realization is that they will never know for certain unless they ask. This is why that forgotten question has suddenly become so important. It isn't only about curiosity. It represents everything they assumed instead of communicating, everything they decided instead of discovering. everything they believed about you without giving you the chance to speak for yourself. And maybe they are beginning to understand that the connection didn't become complicated because there were no feelings. It became complicated because too many feelings were left unexplained. You might remember moments when they seemed to misunderstand you completely. Maybe you gave them space because you thought they needed it, and they interpreted that space as emotional distance. Maybe you waited for them to reach out because you wanted to know whether they genuinely wanted the connection, and they interpreted your waiting as indifference. Maybe you stopped explaining yourself because you were tired of feeling like you had to convince someone of your intentions, and they interpreted your silence as proof that you didn't care. Do you see how easily two people can create completely different stories from the exact same moment? One person is thinking, I need them to show me that this matters. The other person is thinking, they don't want me anymore. Neither person is necessarily trying to hurt the other. They are simply reacting to information they never properly received. And that may be what your soulmate is finally understanding now. They didn't necessarily lose the connection because they knew you didn't want them. They may have lost it because they never asked whether you did. That distinction is enormous, because if they were certain you didn't care, they could move forward believing they made the right choice. But if they now realize they never actually knew your answer, then their certainty begins to collapse. Suddenly, old memories become questionable. Was that really what they meant? Did I misunderstand that conversation? Were they waiting for me to say something? Did I walk away when they were actually hoping I would stay? Those questions can become incredibly powerful because there is no easy way to answer them from a distance. And perhaps this is why your soulmate may be replaying certain moments more often now. They are searching the past for clues. They are looking at conversations they once considered finished and wondering whether they missed something important. They may remember your expression when they said goodbye. They may remember how long you looked at them before turning away. They may remember a message you sent that seemed ordinary at the time, but now feels strangely meaningful. They may even remember something you said that they didn't understand until much later. It's almost like reading an old letter with completely different eyes. The words haven't changed, but the person reading them has. And now they may be discovering meanings they were emotionally incapable of seeing before. Perhaps you once tried to tell them what you needed without directly saying it. Perhaps you hoped they would ask the question themselves. Maybe you thought they would notice. And when they didn't, you eventually stopped trying to explain. That doesn't necessarily mean you were meant to remain silent forever. It simply means that there was a moment when you needed them to meet you halfway. And they didn't. They may now understand that you weren't asking them to read your mind. You were hoping they would care enough to ask. That is the difference, because when someone asks, "What are you really feeling?" they are not demanding an answer. They are creating a space where honesty becomes possible. And perhaps your soulmate never created that space. They wanted certainty without vulnerability. They wanted answers without asking difficult questions. They wanted to understand your heart without risking the possibility that your truth might challenge what they believed. But now they may be realizing that avoiding the question did not protect them from pain. It simply delayed it. The question they avoided back then has followed them into the present, carrying every possibility they never explored. And the more they think about it, the more they may wonder whether the answer would have changed everything. Maybe you would have told them you still cared. Maybe you would have admitted that you were afraid. Maybe you would have told them you wanted them to stay. Maybe you would have revealed something they had been desperately trying to understand. Or maybe your answer would have surprised them completely. That uncertainty is what makes the regret so powerful. They don't actually know what you would have said, and now they cannot simply travel backward and ask. They have to live with the possibility that the story they told themselves about you was never the complete story. And perhaps that is the realization that hurts the most. They thought they were walking away from an answer they already knew, when in reality they were walking away from a question they never had the courage to ask. And now the question begins to take on a life of its own, because your soulmate may no longer be wondering only what they should have asked you back then. They may be imagining the answer they could have received, and that is where the emotions become much harder to control. They may replay the old conversations in their mind and create different versions of what might have happened if they had simply stopped for a moment and said, "Tell me what you really feel." Maybe you would have opened up. Maybe you would have admitted that you cared more deeply than you ever showed. Maybe you would have told them that you were afraid of losing them. Maybe you would have asked them to stay. Or perhaps you would have revealed something completely different, something they could never have predicted. And that uncertainty is exactly what makes this realization so powerful. They don't know your answer. They only know that they never gave themselves the opportunity to hear it. Imagine finding a letter written years ago but never opening the envelope. You know there are words inside, but you have no idea whether they would bring comfort, heartbreak, forgiveness, or something that changes the entire way you remember the past. That may be how your soulmate feels about you now. Your answer has become an unopened letter in their mind. They can imagine it, but they cannot know it. And perhaps they are starting to understand that what they miss isn't simply the conversations you had. They miss the possibility of the conversation they never had. That's a completely different kind of longing. When someone misses a memory, they can replay it. When someone misses an unanswered possibility, their mind keeps creating new endings. Your soulmate may be doing exactly that. They may think, if I had asked them then, would they have told me the truth? Then another thought appears. What if their answer would have changed everything? Then another. What if I walked away from something that was actually mutual? These questions can become difficult to silence because there is no final answer waiting for them. And perhaps this is why certain memories have started feeling different. A simple look from you may suddenly seem meaningful. A conversation they once dismissed may now feel like evidence of something deeper. A moment when you seemed unusually quiet may now make them wonder what you were holding inside. Even your smallest reactions can take on a different meaning when someone begins questioning the story they once believed. They may be looking backward not because they want to live in the past, but because they are trying to understand what they failed to see while they were standing inside it. And there is something especially painful about realizing that the person you wanted to understand may have been waiting for you to ask the very question you were too afraid to ask. Maybe you were both waiting for the other person to make the first move emotionally. Maybe you were both protecting yourselves. Maybe you were both afraid that honesty would create a rejection you couldn't take back. So instead of asking, you both watched. You interpreted. You guessed. You waited, and eventually the silence became its own answer. But silence isn't always truth. Sometimes silence is simply two people being afraid at the same time. That may be one of the deepest realizations your soulmate is having now. They may be discovering that what they once interpreted as distance could have been hesitation. What they interpreted as indifference could have been self-protection. What they interpreted as rejection could have been your attempt to see whether they were willing to choose you without being pushed. And if they are thinking about this now, they may be realizing that they were searching for certainty from your behavior when they could have simply asked for honesty. That realization can create a very specific kind of regret because it forces them to question their own role in the story. They cannot blame timing for everything. They cannot blame circumstances for everything. They cannot say they never had an opportunity to understand you. Perhaps they did. Perhaps you were giving them small openings all along. Perhaps there were moments when you were waiting for them to notice that something deeper was happening. And perhaps they were too focused on protecting themselves to step through those openings. Imagine two people standing on opposite sides of a river, each waiting for the other to build a bridge. Neither person moves because both are afraid of being the one who takes the first step. Years pass, and eventually one person walks away, believing the other never cared enough to cross. But what if both were waiting? What if both wanted the same thing, but were afraid to reveal it? That possibility can be devastating because it changes the meaning of everything. Your soulmate may now be wondering whether the connection ended because the feelings weren't strong enough, or because neither of you ever created enough space for the truth to come out. And perhaps they are beginning to understand that asking one honest question could have removed years of uncertainty. What do you actually want from me? Do you still feel something? Were you hoping I would stay? Did you ever see a future with me? They may have had dozens of opportunities to ask something like this, but fear has a strange way of making simple questions feel dangerous. Because once you ask, you have to be prepared for the answer. And maybe that was what they were really afraid of. Not your rejection, but your truth. Because your truth could have forced them to make a decision. If you had said you cared, they would have had to decide whether they were brave enough to stay. If you had said you were hurt, they would have had to confront what they had done. If you had said you wanted something real, they would have had to stop hiding behind uncertainty. Sometimes people avoid questions because questions demand responsibility. But now the question they avoided may be demanding attention anyway. And perhaps your soulmate is realizing that no matter how much time passes, they cannot change the fact that they never heard your answer. They can imagine it. They can hope for it. They can fear it. But they cannot know it unless the question is finally spoken. That is why the memory keeps returning. That is why the old conversations suddenly feel unfinished. That is why the silence feels different now. They are beginning to understand that the missing piece of the story may have been sitting inside your heart the entire time. And the painful part is that they may never know whether the answer they desperately wish they had heard is still the answer you would give today. And this is where your soulmate may be realizing just how much one unanswered question could have changed the entire direction of your connection. Until now, they may have looked at the past as something that simply happened, something shaped by timing, circumstances, misunderstandings, and choices that could no longer be changed. But now they may be looking at it differently. They may be realizing that there was a moment when everything was still possible. When one honest question could have opened a conversation that never happened. And perhaps that conversation could have changed what came next. Imagine standing at a crossroads with two roads in front of you, choosing one because you assume the other leads nowhere, only to discover years later that the road you ignored was the one leading somewhere you desperately wanted to go. That may be the realization your soulmate is carrying now. They may remember the moment they decided not to ask. Maybe they were afraid of appearing too vulnerable. Maybe they didn't want to hear an answer that could hurt them. Maybe pride convinced them that if you truly cared, you would say something first. Or perhaps they believed they had already figured you out. But now they may understand that believing you know someone's heart without ever asking them is one of the easiest ways to misunderstand someone completely. And this realization can make old memories feel almost unbearable. A conversation that once seemed insignificant may suddenly feel like a missed opportunity. A moment when you looked at them differently may suddenly seem like a question you were silently asking. A pause in the conversation may now feel like the space where they should have said, "Tell me what you're really thinking." They may be wondering how different everything could have been if they had been brave enough to interrupt the assumptions and simply ask, what if you had told them that you still cared? What if you had admitted that you were waiting for them to become honest? What if you had told them that you were afraid too? What if you had said that you didn't want to lose them? These possibilities can be powerful because they don't provide closure. They create alternate versions of the past. And your soulmate may now be living inside those possibilities, wondering which version of the story could have become real. But perhaps the most important realization is that they are no longer blaming everything on circumstances. They may be beginning to see their own hesitation in the middle of the story. They had choices. They could have asked. They could have listened. They could have stayed a little longer. They could have said what they were feeling instead of expecting you to somehow understand it without being told. And maybe they now understand that the connection didn't necessarily fail because there was nothing there. It may have failed because the truth never received enough room to breathe. That is a painful distinction. Because if there were no feelings, then walking away would be simple. But if there were feelings, and both people were simply too afraid, too guarded, or too uncertain to speak them, then the ending carries a completely different weight. Your soulmate may now be asking themselves, did I mistake their silence for an answer? That question can change everything, because perhaps your silence wasn't saying, I don't care. Perhaps it was saying, I don't know if you care enough to ask. Perhaps your distance wasn't saying, go away. Perhaps it was saying, show me that you actually want me here. And perhaps your decision to stop explaining yourself wasn't a sign that the connection meant nothing. Maybe you simply became exhausted from trying to communicate something that you wished they would have cared enough to discover themselves. This is where regret becomes deeply personal. They may realize that they wanted certainty from you while refusing to offer certainty themselves. They wanted to know where you stood while remaining afraid to reveal where they stood. They wanted the comfort of knowing your feelings without taking the emotional risk of asking for them. And now they may understand that love doesn't work like that. You cannot stand at the edge of someone's heart and demand a map while refusing to step closer. At some point, someone has to be brave enough to ask the question that could change everything. Perhaps that is the moment they keep replaying now. The moment before they walked away. The moment before the conversation ended. The moment when you were still close enough for them to ask, and they chose silence instead. They may wish they could return to that exact moment, not to change everything immediately, but simply to say one sentence differently. Can I ask you something? And then finally ask what they should have asked all along. But time doesn't move backward. The person you were then may not be the person you are now. Your circumstances may have changed. Your expectations may have changed. Your heart may have learned things it didn't know back then. And that is what makes their realization even more frightening. They may finally understand the importance of the question at the exact moment they are no longer certain they have the right to ask it. Perhaps they have spent so long imagining your answer that they are now terrified of hearing the real one. Because the real answer could confirm what they secretly hope for, or it could force them to accept that the opportunity they once had is gone. Either way, they would finally know. And maybe that is what they are struggling with most. For so long, uncertainty allowed them to keep both possibilities alive. They could tell themselves that perhaps you still cared, perhaps you didn't, perhaps things could have been different, perhaps they couldn't. But one honest conversation would remove that protective space. It would turn imagination into truth. And now they may be realizing that the question they never asked wasn't just a missed conversation. It represented a door they chose not to open. The door may still exist, but they have no idea what is waiting on the other side anymore. And that leaves them with one final, deeply uncomfortable thought. Even if they finally find the courage to ask you now, will you still give them the answer they once had the chance to hear? And now everything comes down to the question they never asked, because your soulmate may finally be realizing that the answer is no longer something they can simply imagine. It is something they would have to hear from you. After replaying old conversations, questioning their assumptions, and wondering how differently things could have unfolded. They may now be standing in front of a truth they cannot avoid anymore. They don't actually know what you felt back then, and they don't know what you feel now. That uncertainty may be exactly what has been keeping this connection alive in their mind. They can imagine that you still care. They can imagine that you have completely moved on. They can imagine that you would forgive them. They can imagine that you would never open that door again. But imagination is safe because it never forces a person to face reality. Asking you would, and perhaps that is why they have been hesitating. Because if they finally ask the question, they will also have to accept whatever answer comes back. Maybe they secretly hope you would say, I was waiting for you to ask. Maybe they imagine you telling them that you cared more than they ever knew. Maybe they picture you admitting that you were afraid too, that you didn't know what they wanted, and that there was a time when you would have chosen the connection if they had simply been honest. But there is another possibility they may be afraid to consider. Maybe your answer has changed. Maybe you no longer need the explanation you once desperately wanted. Maybe you have grown beyond the version of yourself who was waiting for them to finally understand. And that possibility can be more frightening than rejection, because it means time has actually changed something they once believed would always remain available. Imagine returning to a place that once felt like home, and finding the street still familiar, but realizing you no longer have the same key. The house exists, the memories exist, the doorway exists, but you cannot assume you can simply walk inside. That may be how your soulmate sees you now. They remember the person you were, but they know they don't fully know the person you have become. And perhaps they are wondering whether the answer they wanted years ago would even be the answer you would give today. This is where the emotional power shifts back to you. For so long, they may have been the one carrying the unanswered question, but you don't have to carry the responsibility of solving it for them. You don't have to chase them. You don't have to send a message just to give them closure. You don't have to explain feelings they should have cared enough to ask about when the opportunity was right in front of them. If they genuinely want to know what you felt, they may eventually have to find the courage to ask. And if they do, you will have the freedom to decide whether you even want to answer. That is important because the purpose of this realization isn't necessarily to promise that they will return tomorrow or that everything will suddenly become perfect. The deeper realization is that something they once dismissed has become impossible for them to ignore. They now understand that they made decisions based on assumptions. They understand that your silence wasn't automatically an answer. They understand that distance doesn't explain what was happening inside your heart. And most importantly, they understand that there was a version of the story they never discovered because they never asked the question that mattered. Perhaps this is why certain memories keep resurfacing for them. Perhaps this is why a song, a place, a conversation, or even a random quiet moment can suddenly bring you back into their thoughts. Their mind may still be searching for the answer it never received. What did they really feel? What did they want from me? Was there still a chance? Did I misunderstand everything? These questions may continue until they finally decide whether they are willing to face the truth. And maybe the greatest irony is that they once believed asking the question would make them vulnerable, when in reality, not asking may have cost them much more. Because vulnerability can hurt for a moment. Regret can stay for years. A difficult answer can be painful. But an unanswered question can create an entire lifetime of possibilities that can never be confirmed. Your soulmate may now understand that. They may realize that they weren't protecting themselves when they stayed silent. They were protecting themselves from uncertainty, and in doing so, they created a much deeper uncertainty that followed them long after the connection changed. And perhaps somewhere inside them, there is still a sentence they wish they could say, "I should have asked you when I had the chance." Not because they know what your answer would have been, but because they finally understand that your answer deserved to exist. You deserved the chance to speak. You deserved the chance to be understood instead of interpreted. And they deserved the chance to know the truth instead of building a story around assumptions. Maybe that is the lesson this connection has been trying to teach both of you. Sometimes two people don't lose each other because they stopped caring. Sometimes they lose each other because they were afraid to ask, afraid to answer, afraid to reveal too much, and afraid of what honesty might change. But now your soulmate may no longer be afraid of the question itself. They may be afraid that the question has arrived too late. And that leaves one final mystery hanging between you. If they finally stood in front of you today and asked the question they should have asked back then, would your answer still be the one they have been secretly hoping for? Or would they discover that while they were searching for the courage to understand you, you had already learned how to understand yourself?